You guys wanted to know more about David Allen Rundle, and wow, this is a tough one. We're talking about a convicted serial killer, and he killed 3 people in Northern California.
Back in
Yeah,
1986,
1986.
it's one of those cases that just makes you think about, like what makes people do these horrible things? What are the things that contribute to these acts?
Right, and before we really get into it, I think we should acknowledge the victims. Elizabeth Latour Lactoine and Caroline Marie Garcia and Lancian Sorensen.
Absolutely. We can't forget about them. I mean, really, their stories are why we even talking about this today.
Yeah, so let's get into it. So Rundle was born in 1965. Seems like a pretty normal childhood at first, at least. He liked to hunt and fish.
Which is kind of surprising.
Yeah, when you think about what he ended up doing, but then things took a really dark turn when he was just 14 years old.
Started experimenting with drugs.
Yeah, he got into drugs. Is that something that comes up a lot with serial killers? Is there research on that?
There's definitely a correlation between early drug use and violence, but it's important to remember that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation.
Right, right.
It's not always just one thing. It's usually a really complicated mix of, mental stuff, environmental influences, maybe even some biological things too.
So in his case, it really does sound like all of those things kind of came together. His family life was really messed up. He left his pregnant wife, and he didn't get along with his parents. And there are even some people saying that his mom sexually abused him. We were talking about nature versus nurture before. Can you talk about that a little more? Like, how does that apply to Rundle's life?
Sure, the nature versus nurture debate is trying to understand how much genetics play a role in our behavior and how much comes from our environment. So with Rundle, there's some evidence for both sides. Some researchers think that certain genes could make someone more likely to be violent or impulsive, and that would be the nature side of it. But on the other hand, he had a really rough childhood. Like you said, abandonment, family problems, possible abuse. That stuff definitely leaves a mark, and that's more the nurture side.
Yeah, I mean, it's like everything was stacked against him from the beginning. But like you said, it's not usually just one thing. So what else could have been a factor?
Well, one thing we see a lot in these cases is what criminologists call behavioral escalation. It means criminal behavior gets more frequent, more serious, more violent over time. And Rundle is a perfect example of this. When you look at the timeline of his crimes, it's a clear pattern.
Okay, I think I'm ready to talk about the murders now. This is going to be hard to hear, but I think it's important. So Rundle's first victim was Elizabeth Latour Lactoine. Can you tell us what happened to her?
So this was in May of 1986. Rundle was high on marijuana, and he met Elizabeth, who was 21 years old, near the Sacramento River. He convinced her to go to a secluded place, and, well, he strangled her there and left her body under a bridge.
It's scary how easily he was able to get her to go to that isolated spot. Do we know if he was targeting her specifically, or is this just a random thing?
It's tough to say for sure without knowing what Rundle was thinking, but, this case really shows a pattern we see a lot with serial killers. They often exploit people who are vulnerable. Elizabeth was probably just trying to be nice, or maybe she wanted to help someone who seemed like they were in trouble, and that made her an easy target for Rundle.
Yeah, that's really sad. And then just a few months later, he did it again. This time he took 18-year-old Caroline Marie Garcia from a bus stop.
Right, and this is where you really see that escalation we talked about before. This wasn't just random, this was planned out. Rundle took Caroline to a place where nobody would see them. Then he raped her, beat her, and strangled her. Her body wasn't found until after Rundle was arrested, which means her family had to wait months before they knew what happened to her.
Awful. It's just horrible. And it didn't end there. In October of that same year, he went after 15-year-old Lancian Sorensen.
Lancian's case is, well, it might be the most disturbing of the three. He kidnapped her, forced her to take off her pants, and used them to tie her hands before raping and strangling her. Her body was left next to the Interstate 80 off-ramp, just like she was trash.
You mentioned before that serial killers often have a specific way they commit their crimes. Do you see any patterns in Rundle's crimes?
Oh, yeah, you're right. Big catch. That's called modus operandi, or MO. It basically means the way they do their crimes. With Rundle, we see that he liked to target women who seemed vulnerable, and he would often strangle them and then leave their bodies in places that were kind of hidden but still sort of out in the open. But what's really disturbing is how he went from a crime that maybe seemed more impulsive with Elizabeth to these really planned out and brutal attacks on Caroline and Lancian. It's like he was getting worse and worse, and he didn't seem to care at all.
This is just so much to take in. How did it all end? How did they finally catch Rundle?
Actually, kind of a crazy story. So Caroline Marie Garcia was still missing at this point, right? And the police were out looking for her. They were searching around Rollins Lake Road because they had found one of her things there. Well, Rundle happened to be driving in that same area, and he crashed his car right into the back of a police car.
Are you serious? What are the chances of that?
I know, right? It's like something you'd see in a movie, but it really happened. Rundle probably freaked out and wasn't paying attention, and that's why he crashed. He managed to get away, but this is what really got the investigation going.
So even though he got away at first, this crash is what led them to him.
Exactly. The police car was damaged, and that gave them a clue. They were able to figure out what kind of car Rundle was driving, and then they tracked him down. He took off and ran to Nevada,
Oh, wow.
but the police were right behind him, and they caught him and brought him back to California.
So now he's back in California and he's going to face justice. What happened next? Did he admit to the murders?
Yeah, he did, and this is where things get really interesting from a psychological standpoint. You see, Rundle confessed to all 3 murders, but his explanation was kind of complicated.
Okay.
He said he was a sick individual, and he blamed his actions on being mentally ill, having a bad childhood, and being addicted to drugs and alcohol.
So he was trying to say it wasn't really his fault.
It sounds like it, yeah. But what do forensic psychologists say about these kinds of confessions? How do they know if someone is really sorry or just trying to get out of trouble?
That's a great question. It's something that forensic psychologists deal with all the time. They have to look at a lot of different things: the suspect's mental state, their past, the situation surrounding the confession, even their body language and nonverbal cues. It's like putting a puzzle together. Each piece gives you more information.
So it's not as simple as just believing what they say.
Nope, not at all. You have to remember that people confess for all sorts of reasons. They might be scared or confused, or maybe they even want attention. Wow, this just keeps getting more and more complicated. We've covered a lot, but it feels like we're just getting started.
You're right. There's so much more to talk about. We're going to get into the trial, the sentencing, and the whole debate about capital punishment in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, I can't wait to hear more about that. Welcome back to our deep dive into the case of David Allen Rundle. In part 1, we talked about his background and the horrible crimes he committed and how this crazy coincidence led to him getting caught.
Yeah, we went over a lot, including Rundle's confession and how hard it can be for forensic psychologists to really understand what a confession means.
So we've got this really complicated situation with all these psychological and social and legal issues all mixed together. Right now, Rundle has admitted to the murders, but the legal stuff is just beginning.
Yeah, that's right. A confession is just one piece of the puzzle. They still have to build a whole case with evidence and convince a jury that he's guilty.
So what happened next? What was the trial like?
Well, his trial started in 1989, and it was a big deal in the news. You know, the prosecution had a ton of evidence, DNA evidence, that connected Rundle to the crimes, people who saw things and testified, and of course his own confession.
Did Rundle's lawyers try to say he wasn't guilty because he was insane? Like, he had mentioned having mental problems, right?
They did. They argued that because of his messed up childhood, his drug use, and his mental health issues, he shouldn't be held fully responsible. They brought in some psychologists who had examined Rundle, and they backed up the defense's arguments.
That brings up a really important point about mental health and the legal system. Some people might say that focusing on his past is just a way to downplay his responsibility. What do you think about that?
It's a tough question, and people have been debating it forever. On the one hand, we have to acknowledge that mental illness can really affect someone's judgment, their ability to control themselves, even their ability to know right from wrong.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, people have to be held accountable for what they do. The legal system has to find a balance between understanding and justice.
So it's like this constant back and forth between trying to figure out why someone commits a crime and making sure the victims get justice.
Exactly. In Rundle's case, the jury decided against the insanity defense. They found him guilty of murdering Caroline Marie Garcia and Lancian Sorensen, and he was sentenced to death for those crimes.
Wow, the death penalty, that's a big deal. What about Elizabeth Latour Lactowen's murder?
He was found guilty of that one too, but he got a life sentence. It's not really clear why the sentences were different for the 3 murders.
Huh.
It could be that the evidence in Elizabeth's case wasn't as strong, or maybe the jury felt like there were some things that made that crime a little different.
That makes sense. I guess now we're talking about life on death row, which is something most people don't know much about. What's it really like for inmates who are waiting to be executed?
It's a pretty grim place. It's very controlled. They spend almost all day alone in their cells. They can't move around freely, and they hardly ever talk to anyone outside the prison.
That sounds so isolating and eyeful. I bet just knowing that you could be executed at any time must be really hard to deal with.
Definitely. Studies have shown that death row inmates have much higher rates of depression, anxiety, and PTSD than other prisoners.
That makes sense. You mentioned before that death row inmates come from all different backgrounds and have their own stories. Did Rundle cause problems in prison, or was he a quiet inmate?
Well, he wasn't exactly a model prisoner. In 1987, he was attacked in his sleep by his cellmate at San Quentin Melton. Eugene Voigt was waiting for his trial for armed robbery, and for some reason he fractured Rundle's skull. It was a brutal attack.
Oh my God. That's terrifying. Was there a reason why Voigt attacked him, or was it just random prison violence?
It's hard to know for sure. Prisons are dangerous places, and violence can happen at any time. Some people think Voigt might have had mental health problems that led him to do it, while others think maybe they had some kind of personal disagreement. Whatever the reason, it shows how dangerous prison life is, even for people who are already condemned to death.
It makes you think that even in prison, There's still violence and trauma. This case is really a whirlwind of emotions and information. We've been talking a lot about Rundle and his crimes, but I want to make sure we don't forget about the victims and their families.
You're so right. It's easy to get lost in the legal and psychological details, but we can't forget about the real people whose lives were destroyed. Elizabeth Caroline and Lancianne were daughters, friends, sisters. They were taken away from their loved ones, and their families have been through so much pain. We need to hear their stories and remember them.
What kind of help is there for families who have been through something like this?
There are a lot of organizations out there that offer support to victims of violent crime and their families. They provide counseling, legal help, even financial assistance to help them cope with everything.
It's good to know there's help available for the people who need it most. This case has been so heavy, I can't even imagine what those families have gone through.
Yeah, it's important to recognize the impact of these crimes. The trauma doesn't just affect the victims, it affects whole communities. It reminds us that we need to do more to support people who have been through this and to try to stop these kinds of crimes from happening in the best place.
So we've talked about Rundle's trial, his sentence, what it's like on death row, and how his crimes have affected the victims and their families. What else do we need to cover in this last part of our deep dive?
Well, now that we've laid out all the basic information, I think we can start to look at some of the bigger questions. We need to go deeper than just the facts and think about the psychological and social factors that were involved.
I'm ready for that. I really want to know more about what made Rundle do these things. What was going on in his head? Why would he cause so much pain?
Those are great questions, and I'm going to try to answer them in the last part of our deep dive. We'll look at Rendell's psychological profile, how his childhood trauma might have affected him, his drug abuse. We'll even talk about the controversial question of whether someone like Rendell is born evil or if it's their experiences that make them that way.
That's a discussion I'm really interested in, something people have been trying to figure out for centuries.
Me too. It reminds us that even in the worst parts of humanity, there are still things we can learn and understand.
That's a good point. We'll be back soon with part 3, the final part of our deep dive into the case of David Allen Rundle. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We're back for the final part of our deep dive into the David Allen Rundle case. We've talked about a lot of heavy stuff, his rough childhood, the awful murders he did, the trial, and even what it's like on death row.
It's been a tough journey, no doubt about it, but I think there's something important about looking into these dark parts of human behavior. It helps us understand the criminal mind, and the things that lead to violence.
You're right, and in this last part, I really want to focus on why Rundle did what he did. We know what he did, but I'm curious about what motivated him to commit such horrible crimes.
Yeah, it's the question everyone wants to know, right? What makes someone take another person's life, especially in such brutal and seemingly random ways?
Exactly. In part 1, you talked about nature versus nurture and how it relates to criminal behavior. Can we use that to understand Rundle? Was he just born evil, or did the things that happened to him turn him into a monster?
That's a huge question, and there's no easy answer. Honestly, it's hardly ever one or the other. It's usually both nature and nurture kind of working together, a mix of things you're born with and things that happen to you.
Okay, so let's break that down. What about the nature part? What kind of things could someone be born with that might make them more likely to be violent?
Well, there are some researchers who think certain people are just genetically predisposed to be aggressive or impulsive. There's some interesting research about neurotransmitters, things like serotonin and
Oh,
dopamine.
yeah, I've heard of those.
They help regulate mood and behavior, and if they're not balanced, it could make someone more prone to violence.
So you're saying some people might be wired differently right from the start, making them more likely to be violent?
It's possible, and there's more and more evidence to support that idea, but it's super important to remember that genes aren't everything. Even if someone has genes that makes them more aggressive, it doesn't automatically mean they're going to become violent.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about the nurture side? How did Rundle's life experiences play into this?
Well, his childhood was really traumatic. He was abandoned by his father, had a bad relationship with his mother, and there were even accusations of sexual abuse. Those kinds of experiences, especially when you're young, can have a huge impact on how your brain develops and how you learn to regulate your emotions.
You mentioned earlier that childhood trauma can mess with the development of empathy. Can you talk about that a little more?
Sure. So empathy is the ability to understand and share someone else's feelings. It's what lets us connect with people on an emotional level and see their humanity, even if they're different from us. When a kid goes through trauma like neglect or abuse, it can really screw up the development of empathy in their brain.
So it's like those bad experiences disconnected him from other people's feelings. He couldn't really understand the pain he was causing.
Exactly. It's not that people like Rundle can't feel anything. It's more that they have trouble connecting with and understanding the emotions of other people.
Man, that's disturbing. And we know that Rundle had problems with drugs and alcohol, too. What role could that have played in his crimes?
Substance abuse is really complicated. It often goes hand in hand with mental health issues and criminal behavior. Drugs and alcohol can lower your inhibitions, make you do things without thinking, and make you more impulsive, so you're more likely to do risky or violent things. In Rundle's case, his addiction probably made his mental problems even worse, making it more likely he would lash out violently.
It sounds like Rundle was a ticking time bomb with all those factors combined. A possible genetic predisposition towards aggression, a terrible childhood and drug addiction. But even with all that, it's still hard to grasp how someone could do those awful things. It's almost impossible to understand.
I know what you mean. It's a natural reaction to want to separate ourselves from those kinds of horrors, to see someone like Rundle as a monster, someone inhuman. But the truth is, he was human, and that's maybe the scariest part of it all.
You're right, it shows us like anyone is capable of evil, and it's usually a bunch of different things that determine whether that evil takes over. This deep dive has been really informative, but man, it's been heavy. What's the most important thing that you want people to take away from our exploration of the David Allen Rundle case?
I think the big takeaway is that these cases are really complicated, and we can't just rely on simple explanations. We have to look at the nuances. There's no single reason why someone becomes a serial killer. It's like a perfect storm of biological, psychological, social, and environmental factors that come together in this awful way.
You've given us a lot to think about. It's a reminder that the line between good and evil isn't always so clear, and that even in the darkest parts of humanity, there are still lessons to be learned. Thank you so much for guiding us through this tough but important topic.
You're welcome. And to everyone listening, keep looking into these complex issues, keep asking the hard questions, and never forget the real people behind the stories we hear.
Well said. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.